Here we go.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Duarte Moraes. I'll be hosting and moderating today's webinar. We're going to give it another couple of minutes as people trickle in, and we'll start in just a second. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to volume 37 of SCoT webinars. These webinars, my colleagues and I thought of beginning this initiative right in the thick of the beginning of the pandemic, because as we all know, the pandemic kind of exposed the limitations of our tourism industry. And we all scrambled at the time to pivot on how we discuss our ideas and how we share them and how we try to engage with each other to find solutions. And with the impossibility of travel to meet, a lot of people started having gatherings virtually like this. But we noticed that a lot of the work done was to help the formal sector in tourism adapt to this shock that the pandemic created. And the small communities that were often most dependent on tourism revenues were left unattended. And a lot of, as academics engaged with communities, felt like, we were unable to continue to engage with them, continue to discuss our topics, and continuing to be of service to these people that we study and that we serve. And likewise, then as we thought about beginning this, we realized that maybe there's a silver lining from this mess we've been going through, and that we can kind of revolutionize how academic knowledge in tourism is blended and hybridized with knowledge from the industry and from communities. So that's how SCoT was born, to create this network of tourism professors connected with industry, connected with communities, so that we can, build the system, the tourism system better, build it back better, because we have known that it hasn't always lived up to its, desired role to make this world a better place where there's equitable and sustainable prosperity. So, before we begin, I just wanted to point out a few parameters that would make this webinar most useful. If you are not presenting, if you're not a panelist, please switch off your camera. It'll help us optimize bandwidth. I will personally be looking at the chat. And so anytime that you have thoughts stemming from the discussion of the panelists, please write them down. Feel free to do that. And I'll be looking at them, taking notes, and we'll have an ample time to have Q&A. And I'll turn around some of those comments to the panelists and see how they react to your thoughts and your questions. We're recording this and it'll be on our YouTube channel. And we now have a library of almost 40 webinars that tourism professors can use in their classes, communities can use to share, to kind of stimulate ideas. And so hopefully this is a growing resource to all of us. And lastly, I wanted to point out today in particular, but certainly through our previous webinars, we're going to push the envelope and not just share information, but really hopefully create new ideas and directions and knowledge. And all of that is public access. So this is a Creative Commons attribution license, meaning that anything we discussed here discuss here, the public, other researchers, other communities and consultants are free to use. And we just appreciate that it mentioned that it came from a SCoT webinar. So the focus of today's webinar is on how augmented intelligence or artificial intelligence or machines, how we can use these analytical power to help manage, direct, administer destinations in a better way. So to be clear, this webinar is not about how to use AI or analytics to grow tourism again or to help tourism numbers grow after the pandemic. That is not the purpose of this webinar. There is a lot of use of using AI and chat bots and automation to help the industry, and that work can be useful. It certainly is useful, and some of our colleagues have devoted their careers to figuring these kinds of issues out. And a review of literature in tourism already shows a lot of papers addressing how AI is helping and is being used and can even be used better by hospitality industry, the airlines, and just kind of to improve the experience of the visitors. What this webinar is about is on how actually use AI to help with destination stewardship. And in SCoT, we were among the first to really rely on this new emerging term of destination stewardship. It's not destination development or management. It's how to be good stewards of this destination. And this term, in my understanding, it even stems from the International Destination Professional Association called Destinations International. And it's been now defined by more like sustainable tourism organizations, as you can see there. But essentially, it's the idea that the role of tourism agencies and people like all of us, our role is to try to leverage tourism to make the destination communities wonderful places to live, so that the community is healthy and is happy. Because if it is, and I've heard Jafar Jafari mentioned this many times, if you make it the destination a good place to live, then in addition, it'll be a great place to visit as well. So that is the focus of today's webinar. And so as my colleagues, panelists, and I were planning this webinar, it emerged that perhaps it would help for us to think of the health of destinations as a metaphor for what we are trying to accomplish. So really briefly, I won't read through this, but you can see here kind of how we think about it. The public has diseases and syndromes and morbidities and symptoms of illness, and destinations also have those. And I want to draw your attention just a little bit to the notion of defund TDAs. TDAs are organizations that have traditionally been charged with promoting more tourism in their destinations, and their role is changing to becoming more stewards of how tourism operates in the community, and they have felt more and more the pressure to make sure tourism benefits their residents. Otherwise, the residents will increasingly push back and resent tourism and push on policy that controls tourism and hurts the industry. So with that, just point you to the plan for this webinar. We, in good form of SCoT, we have first the voice of the local person. This is a resident of a very popular tourism destination in North Carolina, Asheville, and some of you may know Asheville, one of the wonderful places to visit in our state. And then after that, we have three tourism professors from around the world, and they are not just any tourism professor. These are colleagues of mine that are, with their hands in the real world of tourism. They interact with destination communities, and they've been trying to seek solutions for their well-being, for those destinations, sustainable and equitable development. And then we are going to bridge or jump over, to another field of augmented intelligence, and we have someone from the industry, from the AI industry, and he has been pursuing solutions to use AI to assist public health and pharma. And so we'll go back to that, the health, the metaphor of the health of destinations, to see how he can help us envision how we use AI not to promote more tourism, but rather to improve the health of our destinations. And that'll take care of the structured part of this webinar, and then we'll get on to a discussion about what's next, what kind of research and solutions and discussions do we need to make sure we can harness the potential of AI for the destination stewardship work. So with that, I'd like to give the floor to Isaiah, who will direct us through some insights of his life in a tourism destination. Isaiah.
Yeah, thanks, Duarte. I'd like to share a little bit about maybe me and my work, but also as it relates to where I live. When talking about desirable tourism, it may be odd that I'm speaking because my work is with perhaps the most undesirable tourists out there, teenagers and large groups of them, because I'm a tour operator for educational tours to historic sites, mostly in the US. And while we can agree that young people visiting our nation's historic sites is an important thing, when you're there experiencing it, though, on your own, you probably don't want a busload of them unloading and surrounding you while you're there. Another irony of this line of work is that I'm also not a local to the places I organize tours to, because they're multi-city and multi-destination, so I don't necessarily have to live there. And so that's kind of where Asheville comes in. When I figured out that I didn't have to live all the places I led tours, then I moved to Asheville, North Carolina, and that was 15 years ago. And I think it's important to note that that decision was not because I had business interest here or family. It's just, this is where I wanted to live. And in this regard, I am by no means unique. Since its early beginnings, Asheville has been a place where people have relocated and shaped it. And so a little bit of history helps, I think, this discussion, because when the railroads finally breached the mountains to bring people to Asheville, its primary driving industry was the leisure industry, whether that was in resorts and camps, retreat centers, sanitariums, and guest houses began to proliferate all around the mountains. And Asheville was quite a boom town, but when the Depression hit, it hit Asheville really hard. But this also opened the way for another kind of form of tourism that would become part of Asheville's history, and that is through a lot of the public works. That's when the Blue Ridge Parkway began construction. It's when Great Smoky Mountain National Park was established, and these are the most visited parts of the National Park Service. Also at this time, Biltmore Estate, the largest privately owned home in the United States, it opened up to public tourism during this time. But the city itself sort of was overlooked and was an economic wasteland for most of the rest of the 20th century. And people focused more on the outlying mountains rather than the city. But there were a lot of people taking interest in the city, and these were a lot of people who became new residents, and a lot of them were artists and eccentrics and creative entrepreneurs. And they were perhaps drawn to it because of its economic decline, and that was affordable, and they could sort of put their own creative imprint on the city. And so they had a vision of what the city would look like and become. So we'll move forward to 2006, and that's when I moved here. And at that time, Asheville definitely was already popular, but not to the degree it is now. There were cool restaurants and a few breweries downtown, but it still felt like a place where I saw a lot of familiar faces, and it sort of felt like it was our town. And Asheville began to appear on a lot of top 10 lists of best places to live or best places to visit. More restaurants and a lot more breweries and art galleries and things started opening up. And we cheered when we saw these top 10 lists, because it was sort of validated for people like me who decided to live here. Like, yeah, I made a good choice to live here. Our city's getting attention. But now we get on so many lists, we just sort of shrug and say, oh yeah, we're on another top 10 list. And the type of people who are coming are maybe not people we identify with as much now these days, because our city is now the draw. A lot of people come to Asheville not even really looking to go on a hike or visit Biltmore. The city itself is the party and the destination. And so as changes happened in that regard, that as locals, tourists are among you rather than just out there in the mountains or in the places where you don't live. And all this is happening before the pandemic. And when the pandemic came, through the increased number of people who could work remotely and people looking for a healthier place to live that had a lot of outdoor access, Asheville became one of those really high demand areas where people wanted to relocate to. And so this discussion for me personally, it's sort of hard to separate who is a visiting tourist and who is a newly arrived local, bringing both in a sense are bringing lots of outside income that's changing the city. The pandemic for me personally ended for a while a lot of the tours I work with. And so I began to look for alternate income. And that's when I started becoming an Airbnb host. And I just put up a little screenshot of my listing here in Asheville. We've been doing it for a year now. And but more than just a way to make money, this is also a professional transition for me, because for the first time I became a local host or a local person who is welcoming tourists into my city and my home. And so that shift is also reflected in my blog, where I used to write about places I went to away from home. Now I sort of feature in my blog Asheville, and I put all my local recommendations, and I share this with every guest that stays in our Airbnb. It's been a good experience. I think one reason is because we're encouraging people to experience the city as we would as locals, and as we like living here. And so we really emphasize that for people. We probably like our guests more than maybe some of the tourists we might rub shoulders with downtown. But as for overall local opinion, I do read daily our local newspaper and other sources, and it's not hard to miss that there's a variety of opinions on Asheville's growth, its tourism, the changing real estate market. And so I'm going to share some things that are often discussed here. One hot topic is affordability of housing in particular. I touched on that earlier with a lot of outside money coming in. And in this particular headline, it's not a coincidence that, record high numbers of state park visitors coincides with affordability in a housing crisis, because of the demand of people wanting to not just visit here, but live here. And even though there's a lot of efforts and developers who want to build affordable housing, like in the form of apartments, there's always pushback from the local neighbors who don't want that stuff built near them. Also, another example of it is a proliferation of homeless camps and their forced removal in instances. A lot of people have a sympathetic view, seeing this as a consequence of the unaffordability of living here, while others see it as unsanitary and an eyesore that we don't want to see and that the tourists don't want to see. Also, a frequent headline is about another hotel coming in downtown. There's been so many in the last several years that have come in. The city actually put a moratorium on approving new hotels for a while. It's since been lifted, and they're trying to gauge what they should approve or shouldn't. But a lot of locals feel like the city has sold out to tourist interests and outside developers. And this is somewhat measurable in one regard. I think this was discussed earlier, that by North Carolina state law, 75% of the money generated from the hotel tax must be spent on tourism marketing. And a lot of local officials and even some hotel industry people are trying to change that and recognize that's the disproportionate amount, and more should go to local infrastructure, as was said before, make sure that it's making it a good place to live, not just a good place to visit. And to counterbalance all those top 10 lists we've appeared on before, I noticed recently we've appeared on a few not so good top 10 lists. Asheville was one of the worst places to live based on standard of living. And it's sort of a consequence, again, of the unaffordability of the area in people who are making a living in a leisure economy. And very similarly, this other study, which surveyed locals, showed that people thought Asheville was a better place to visit than it was to actually stay. Now, both percentages are fairly high, but comparing it to national averages, Asheville was much higher for a place to visit, but to national averages, it was lower, seen as a place to live. So again, an indicator that some people here are thinking that Asheville's become too popular for its own good. Now, for me and my house, my wife, my son, and I, we like living in Asheville, and we really enjoy our neighborhood in particular. But if we did start to think that, hey, there's better places to live, we don't want to be here anymore, we want to get out, we frequently get flyers in the mail like this one, letting us know how much homes are selling for in our neighborhood, and that if we want to cash in and make some big bucks, we can do that. But for now, we want to enjoy the spoils of being local residents in Asheville. And just the one little example, since my wife and I got married 4 years ago, twice a month, we take each other out on date nights and try to go to a new place that we haven't been to before on most of those date nights. And in 4 years, we haven't run out of new things to do in Asheville. It's evidence of the sort of explosion in new places to eat and drink and things to do in Asheville. And we recognize that if these things depended only on local dollars for that they wouldn't survive. And so a lot of this is outside money that makes them possible. So like I started the presentation, I sort of think of it as like a busload of middle school students. It's good that they're here, but when we ourselves want to go out to eat or go on a hike or go for a drink, we try to go on those days when that bus isn't going to be there. So it's sort of a bit of a love-hate relationship living in a very popular tourist city. So that's my experience to sort of maybe attach to this academic discussion coming.
Thanks, Isaiah. Yeah, so that was a great point from which to anchor the next three presentations. So we have example of Isaiah Mosteller, who's a local. And so the challenge that we posed to these next three panelists is to how can we what do we know about how locals feel about tourism? What are some key issues that we should be looking at to understand their sentiment? So AI has been used extensively and it continues to grow in its use on understanding the sentiment of tourists so that they can be served better and so that more of them might be able to come and so that we can accommodate more of them. But how can we now try to pick up these incredibly powerful tool that transcends looking at structured data like credit card data and number of visitors and very structured things like that have been the metrics of a destination's success, to start looking at messier, complex data that really get into the sentiment of people like Isaiah and his family and how they kind of make sense in this complex way filled with conflict, as we heard from Isaiah, of like, there's these good things and there's these bad things. So the first of our trio of engaged tourism professors is Bruno Ferreira. And Bruno, would you step up, introduce yourself and go through your insights?
Thank you, Duarte. It's great to be a repeat visitor to this webinar. I'll try to add on to a very comprehensive presentation by the previous panelist. My name is Bruno Ferreira. I'm an assistant professor in tourism development and management at HITECH, which is a collaborative between Arizona State University and Hainan University. We were located in Haikou in China. Previously, I spent 5+ years in North Carolina conducting participatory action research with tourism micro-entrepreneurs, most of them involved in agritourism. And this research also included chefs, restaurateurs, extension agents and tourism authorities, with the goal to bring farmers to the front stage of the visitor industry through partnerships with celebrated chefs. I also spent a year plus accompanying a group of ejidatarios in Puerto Vallarta. These are Mexican farmers who succeeded in developing a communitarian tourism enterprise, which included elements of the local culture in a product that was complementary to the product that was provided by the formal industry. And so in my dissertation research, I was able to draw from these two experiences. So on the one hand, this need to value local resources to source locally, and on the other, to include the marginal communities, and drawing also on permaculture principles and design, we were able to conceptualize, systematize these insights into what we came to label Perma-Tourism. So Perma-Tourism would be a conceptual framework, tourism development toolkit that is focused on the symbiotic relationships between different actors in the tourism business ecosystem, with the goal to uphold visitor experience and at the same time making sure that tourism is there as a permanent source of prosperity for the community. Next slide, Duarte. So two symptoms of the destination health that I care a lot are economic leakage and socioeconomic apartheid. So starting with economic leakage is this idea that most of the tourism dollar is actually leaked out of the community and goes elsewhere. So food is definitely one main factor of that leakage, prominently in the Caribbean, and I suggest that, or I recommend everybody to read the trilogy of papers by Thomas Francois et al. On this topic. It's a great document. And so if you eat a delicious tomahawk steak, I'm sure that some farmer in New Zealand will be really appreciative. But I think that first and foremost, we should benefit the local community. And so where to look for this symptom? Well, food blogs, restaurant reviews, restaurant online menus. I'm not suggesting that we need to create a perfect ratio of locally sourced versus shipped in food, but maybe looking at or how local products are valued or are framed would be a very good starting point. How to fix this? Maybe tapping into Perma-Tourism principle number 5, use and value renewable resources and services. So some examples are intersectoral backward linkages between tourism and the primary sector, between farmers, making sure that farmers are included in the development of those menus at high-end restaurants. Farm to table is a very familiar concept in the US. Agritourism, to educate visitors on the value of short supply chains and so forth. Regarding socioeconomic apartheid, we're thinking of spaces that are designed from the get-go to inhibit social and economic interaction between hosts and guests. And of course, in and of itself, that is problematic and is a perfect recipe for or towards resentment towards tourists. But I also think that there is great value in including local elements or elements of the local culture, because that makes the tourism, the conventional tourism product, more appealing and competitive. So where to look for this? Well, promo materials, packages, TripAdvisor reviews, travel blogs, etc. Can we fix it? Of course, we can fix it. We can tap into Perma-Tourism principle number 8, interzonal synergies. I'm talking about functional relationships between different actors in the Perma-Tourism system. We can have partnerships between chefs and farmers. We can have tourists looking at artworks in the hotel and then visiting this artpreneur for an art walk. We're talking about fork to farmer. Duarte Moraes can speak to this point. Creative tourism, there's a burgeoning area, and of course all sorts of micro entrepreneurship. And I would just like to finish this short presentation with maybe a remark. We know what the symptoms are. We know where to look for them. We know how to fix them. The question, I think, is can AI help us achieving that? And also, even if it can help us in that endeavor, does it even matter? I mean, can we actually influence policy? Are tourism governance bodies willing to make a change? That is it, Duarte.
Thank you, Bruno. All right, on to Whitney Nullenberg, a colleague of mine here at NC State. Whitney, the floor is yours.
And former colleague of Bruno, who just set up beautifully what I'm really excited to talk with you all about. So well done, Bruno. Thank you. As Duarte said, I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Management at NC State. And I think between Duarte, Bruno, Isaiah, and I today, we are doing the work of a tourism development authority for the state of North Carolina, because I think you're getting a great sense of the breadth of what we have to offer in this state as a tourism destination. And probably one of the reasons why it's one of the top 5 visited states in the United States. Isaiah gave you a lot of examples of our beautiful mountains in Asheville and the incredible culture and people that bring people to our state to visit and to live. And I have a lot more context to share with you from the eastern side of the state, our coastal communities, particularly the Outer Banks of North Carolina. But I'll tell you a little bit about my journey before I got to spend some time in the Outer Banks this summer, which really informs a lot of what I want to talk with you about today. So my research primarily focuses on communicating the value of tourism. This is done in a lot of different ways, whether that's through leadership, advocacy, policy, and planning. And I'm really interested in this area because, frankly, the industry as a whole, we forever have been focused on marketing a destination to tourists. And we're really good at telling people how great a destination is and why you should come to Asheville, North Carolina, or the Outer Banks of North Carolina. But what we're really terrible at is telling other people what the good things are that tourism can do for the communities that it is a part of. And so I'm really interested in using my research to help understand what that message is, who we're sharing it to, and who we're listening to. Bruno, to your point about whether or not the authorities who are managing these tourism funds, Isaiah was saying, 75% of the funds goes to promoting tourism in many of these destinations. How are we managing that money and doing well for the people who are being impacted by tourism every day? We need to do a lot more to shift our perspective, not just thinking about the tourists and getting them to come to our destination, but thinking about the people who are being impacted either through their work, their jobs, or being neighbors to these tourists. And so, Duarte, I'm so delighted that Isaiah was able to kick us off and give us that great context. Actually, if you'll go back one slide for me, Duarte, I'm going to talk through just a little bit more with the stakeholder engagement. That's a piece that I've been working on with our Convention and Visitors Bureau right here in Raleigh. So in the central part of the state, got an image on there for Tourism U, which is a program that they created to engage more directly with their stakeholders, both residents as well as stakeholders outside of the tourism industry. So we have a really vibrant healthcare and tech industry in the Triangle of North Carolina, and we're trying to do a better job of communicating the value of tourism to them as well. And Tourism U was one program that I helped to assess the value of for the Greater Raleigh Convention and Visitors Bureau as a technique to help explain that value of tourism to different stakeholders. In the middle there, you see me standing in front of the Capitol building in Virginia. I did my PhD at Virginia Tech, and focused my dissertation work on political leadership within the tourism industry. And I got to work very closely with our Virginia Restaurant, Lodging, and Travel Association, which is the trade association that represents the tourism industry for the Commonwealth of Virginia. And this was a great experience for me because I got to walk the halls, talk with policymakers. I'm standing there with a group of hoteliers from the Virginia Beach area who are trying to communicate the value of tourism to policymakers. So not just, the TDA members who sometimes can't do that. Oftentimes they're sort of bound by their funding structures to who they can talk to about the value of tourism. But individual business owners, employees, residents of destinations, they can be that voice piece for the tourism industry. And they are the ones who need to be able to communicate that value and really understand the value of tourism and to have their voices amplified through advocacy. So advocacy is an area that needs a lot more work in this space. And that's why I'm really excited for this conversation today, that hopefully AI can help us start to think about more of these metrics that we can use. I'll tell you, like walking those halls and talking to policymakers, they want to hear the economic impact, right? They want to know, what's your return on investment on your marketing campaigns? How many jobs are created through tourism? How many revenues are coming in? How many tax receipts? That's all great. But what really got them listening and what got them excited and wanting to hear about tourism were the stories of the people in tourism. So these women that I was standing there with in front of the Capitol building, the story of how they've mentored all these young people from Virginia Beach into getting their first jobs and working their way up through different hotels in the area. That was the story that really resonated and got the attention of the people who are making decisions about tourism. So just some interesting ways to kind of think about that and tell different stories and use different metrics to tell different stories can be really helpful. All of this work and thinking about how we communicate the value of tourism really centers around how we can do a better job of planning and implementing policy to guide sustainable tourism development. And this summer, I was able to live out on the coastal area of North Carolina. We have a string of barrier islands on the very eastern part of the state, the easternmost point in the United States that is known as the Outer Banks. And it's a really unique space. These barrier islands are constantly shifting. So they're dealing with a lot of issues with climate change. They're dealing with a lot of issues with, what space they have to develop still out there and whether or not that's a good idea. And in working with a company, you can see their logo here in the corner of the photo that I've added, Twitty and Company Realtors. They manage over 1,000 vacation properties in the Outer Banks. And they're one of these examples of a company that is actually really interested in trying to change how we think about tourism. And they're taking small steps towards that, like having me come out there this summer and talk with over 40 stakeholders about what does tourism look like in the Outer Banks in the future, the next 5 years, the next 20 years? Because much like what we saw in Asheville with Isaiah, they're dealing with the same issues of affordable housing challenges. They're dealing with issues of workforce development. How would we get people to stay in the workforce out there on top of these other climate change issues that they're dealing with? So Duarte, if you want to go to the next slide for me, I'll give some examples of what I learned from this summer work and talking with these tourism stakeholders about different ways that we might think about these impacts of tourism and how we're sort of measuring these changes in tourism. And at first I want to go back to one. This sounds so trite that we all know this. We've been looking at this for so long, but resident attitudes towards tourism. In talking with so many, whether it was business owners, employees, retirees, residents that worked in other industries outside of tourism in the Outer Banks, so many of them pointed me towards, well, hey, did you see the comments on this story in the Outer Banks Voice? Or are you on this Facebook group where people are talking about this issue? We have gotten so far from having to use the pen and paper survey or online survey to understand resident attitudes towards tourism. There's so many ways to measure this, and it has gotten so very complex. We know that economic benefits are an important influence of whether or not residents support tourism, but it's gone far, far beyond that. When I would talk to people in the Outer Banks this summer, they're talking about like, well, what type of resident are you? Are you a resident that is here to work in the industry, or are you just a retiree who, loved this place and bought a second home and then retired to it when you finished working? And depending on what type of resident you are, you have different views of tourism, how local you are. This was something that was really important to people, kind of tied to this idea of type of resident, but there are people who have had generations of family that lived in these barrier islands and have been connected to this place versus somebody who maybe came down during the pandemic and realized how wonderful it was to live here and then just recently bought a house. And there's this really interesting dynamic of, you know, how local you are and what does that mean about your opinion towards tourism. So some really interesting places, I think, to look for this kind of information. Isaiah, you already referenced a lot of those local newspapers from the Asheville Citizen Times. Most of our destination communities have some sort of media source, and those online comment sections, you know, they always tell you don't read the online comments, right? But that, I think, is a really rich place to learn more about what people are really thinking. I mean, there's a lot of vitriol, there's a lot of anger in there, but there's a lot of truth in sort of understanding the depth and complexity of the resident attitudes towards tourism in a lot of these places. I also think we need to be shifting our thinking not just about residents and sort of lumping them all into this one group of residents, but also thinking about where workforce fits into that. In the Outer Banks, like I said, very, very limited housing stock for people to live in the Outer Banks. It's a phenomenal place to visit. It's a really hard place to live. This summer when I was out there living in Dare County, county of about 37,000 people, there were 5 homes on the market that were a single family home around $300,000, 5 homes for 37,000 people. The market was just absolutely crazy. People who wanted to live and work in the space could not do it. And so they're starting to move further out. And so we're starting to see more of this enclave development. Bruno, like you were talking about with the social apartheid, we're seeing that develop and we're seeing these destinations start to lose that interesting culture, those people that are a part of it and deserve perhaps even more so than our tourists to have the space to live and enjoy and be in. So workforce retainment is a big piece of that. This is the backbone of our tourism industry are the people who work in it, and we need to be really focused on how they are doing, making sure that they have space to live in, making sure that they are supported in the work that they do. And so we have this chance to really move away from the traditional model of the way we've employed people and the way we've engaged with people in the workforce and tourism towards a new approach. And you can see the impacts of this. These are 2 pictures of signs that I took this summer. The top one says, hiring, who isn't? Literally every restaurant, hotel, retail space had a now hiring or apply within sign on the door this summer because they just didn't have the workforce out there. And for some places like the sign there on below from the Sandbars restaurant in Kitty Hawk, they closed. They are permanently closed because they could not staff. And so I think this, is certainly an indicator to me, just this one example of this Sandbars, closing because they couldn't staff, that we've got a serious problem here. So I'm hoping that maybe AI could help think about different ways to start identifying these kind of challenges before we have more things like businesses closing because of lack of staffing. So Bureau of Labor Statistics data, job posting engines. There's new platforms out there like Gig Pro, which is sort of the sharing economy of service workers. I don't want to use too much of our time talking about that, but it's kind of a wild concept. So lots of ways to start thinking about this other really important aspect of our industry that we need to be thinking about their value as a part of what we do. So thanks, Duarte.
Thank you, Whitney. All right, our third presentation from the perspective of tourism. Christine, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, Duarte, and thank you to the previous panel speakers. My name is Christine Bazinde. I am an associate professor. I am at Arizona State University within the School of Community Resources and Development. My research is 2-pronged. I, in essence, focus on the nexus between tourism and elements of justice. The first area that I'll share with you is connected to ways in which within tourism context, we portray contentious historical pasts. And what I'm really interested in that component is ways in which we can package contentious pasts in ways in which offer opportunities for unity, and opportunities for people to heal and learn. And the two images I placed there are actually the Museum of Native American History in Washington, as well as the Museum of African and African American History, because they are the quintessential examples of ways in which the past has been repackaged in a way to offer spaces of learning, but also spaces that, in my mind, allow for a healing through understanding of various cultures. The other component of my research focuses on working with communities, particularly minoritized communities and marginalized communities, in utilizing tourism as a tool to enhance well-being. In the past, we've actually offered up tourism as something that is the panacea to all social, economic, and environmental ills. And as we've seen of recent, it often isn't a solution to all. And so I often will work with many communities to understand what are their needs in terms of enhancing well-being, and what ways does tourism enhance or thwart those needs that they have to enhance their communities. I work predominantly with Indigenous communities. I work with the Native American Navajo community located here in Arizona. I've also done work with the Maasai community in Tanzania and some Mayan communities in Central and South America. So these are things that are near and dear to my heart, trying to figure out ways in which tourism is contributing to better communities, but also ways in which tourism is contributing to more just communities is something that is vital to my understanding and contributions to tourism. We'll move on to the subsequent slide. In response to the question that was asked, what came to mind is it resonates with what my other colleagues have mentioned on the call, but what came to mind for me was the voice of communities. And now, recognizing, as Whitney mentioned, that the voice and communities is not homogeneous. There are various voices, and that's why I placed an S there to make it more plural. But I want to highlight the centrality of listening to the voices of the communities. I think we're all in a stage right now where we've heard ways in which communities can speak in unison, and the power of that in terms of bringing changes within our communities. And so I really do think that it is a key indicator that we cannot overlook. In an era, where we're going through the pandemic and as well as social justice issues that have been brought to the fore, I think the voice of the community is something that we have to pay attention to and not be afraid of. So key things that I think ought to be looked at, and I'm drawing heavily here from the environmental justice literature, because I do think that it has a way to orient us into the ways in which we can understand community perspectives. So first and foremost is this notion of interactional justice, which I think can help us understand ways in which communities and community members experience the locations in which they're in. Things we can ask are they feeling as though they can engage in those spaces and not encounter discriminatory treatment? They feel as though they have the ability to experience valuable moments within those spaces, or are they inhibited by something or some events? And so those become questions that we have to be able to consider. We've seen examples of locations such as Barcelona, where residents within the urban core felt as though they have no access to their grocery stores. They have no access to be able to walk in the streets uninhibited. They felt constrained given one would actually argue the great job that the DMOs had done in terms of promoting tourism. And so that becomes an element of interactional justice that one would have to look at and take the pulse of how the community is feeling in terms of their ability to experience have valuable experiences of the spaces in which they reside. The other element that I'd like to draw our attention to is the notion of distributive justice. And in this context, I think something key for us to take into account do the locals who are within these tourism dependent location or tourism destinations, do they feel as though the common pooled resources have been allocated fairly? Do they feel as though they have access to what they think are public resources? I think this allows us to also be able to see If tourism is either doing more harm than it is doing good, whether locals actually feel as though that's a location that they want to reside in. The quintessential example of a place that we're seeing this being an issue is Sedona in Arizona. For those of you who have been here, residents in Sedona have for a long time now been discouraged by the magnitude of tourism that is happening in Sedona, where they feel as though they do not have access to local parks because of the huge numbers of tourists that are coming in, where they feel as though they don't have pedestrian access because of the numbers of tourists that are coming in, where they feel as though they can't come in and out of their community because it wasn't designed with the residents in mind, but rather designed with the tourists in mind. And so then you realize that a tension emerges between the tourists and the locals as a result of distributive justice elements not having been taken into account by tourism authorities and planners and designers in those locations, I think. So I think paying attention to ways in which distributive justice is planned for within locations and ways in which it is accounted for allows us to get a different pulse on ways in which the communities perceive tourism in their area. The other element is the notion of procedural justice. And in this, things to pay attention to is ways in which communities are involved in the procedural elements that entail developing tourism. So are they equal partners in the decision-making, both before, during, and after? Do they feel as though their voices are heard? They feel as though they can take ownership of the planning process and not just the implementation process of tourism. These become vital things because if they are involved in a meaningful, non-tokenistic way, then they often feel as though they have ownership of tourism and can participate equally in that. But unfortunately, the predominant paradigm has been for planners and tourism authority officials to implement tourism without fully involving the local community in those decisions. And so often what happens is a sense of disinterest, apathy, but also people protesting tourism within these spaces. And so the involvement of locals becomes vital. Their perceptions of whether they're involved or not are another pulse that we could take to see how locals feel about tourism. There are many examples of Indigenous communities that have actually taken matters in their own hands and have decided ways in which to engage or disengage in tourism. And I think there's a lot that we could learn from there. The other key thing I want to highlight in this element is the notion of knowledge. When we think of planning for tourism and design of tourism spaces, we tend to have the perspective of just the experts, the tourism experts, the planners, the designers. And often the local knowledges of the communities are left out of those processes. So what procedural justice says, it's not just involving the physical bodies of the people within those spaces, but also involving their know-how. And having that help and inform the ways in which we develop tourism, and hopefully in a way that is of benefit to the communities in which it is taking place. Like my previous colleagues who spoke, I think it's also important for us to figure out, well, how do we get this information? Whitney mentioned online locations in which we could source some of this information, but I also think the how in the ways in which we connect to communities becomes important in terms of our ability to engage communities. I won't spend too much time on this, but I do think that the fundamental element here entails our reimagining of how we as the academy, as the scientific community, appear within the communities that we are working within. I think we have to change both the ways in which we do things, the ways in which we see things, and the ways in which we are within those communities. Because often we show up within the communities in a way that we are focusing on the pace that we adopt within the academy. And many communities are a completely different pace. And by proceeding on a different pace, we miss out on key things that are emerging and manifesting within the communities. When we show up as the single knowledge holders, that also becomes problematic because then we're not able to share in the multiple knowledges that can inform the situations that manifest within communities. But I also do think that we have to be able to think of our engagement in communities not as a product of our academic outputs, such as journal articles and so forth, but as really engaging in a collaborative co-creation of solutions in those communities that is really meaningful and addresses the needs of the communities in which we're working. Those are the remarks that I have for now. I do have, I would say, in relation to AI, a rather open-minded cynicism connected to AI, but I'll share that when the time is right. Thank you all.
Thanks, Christine. Okay, so an interesting shift now. We're gonna go into talking with John, who's in the industry. He's an entrepreneur, an innovator, and a close collaborator of mine. And so, John, you have allowed us to indulge in sharing our passions, and we've tried to discipline ourselves to be succinct and make that connection, but the time keeps running, and as you can see, it's just hard to contain the complexity of these problems that we study, and also our energy and passion. And so please kind of take us into these tools that we all have very limited understanding of, but we kind of have that curiosity and hope that it'll be a tool that we can start exploring ways to use, so that we can bring the complexity of the problem of being good stewards of a destination to maybe indicators and findings that have the chance to influence policy or to influence some of these prevailing tourism development models. John, go ahead.
That sounds good. Thanks, Bruno. Just to give a level set of who I am and why I'm here. The thing that makes me cool is Duarte's my friend. So otherwise, I'm a co-founder of an analytics company, and we use the term AI when it's useful to us. And my role in the company is business development and commercialization, which sounds like the worst thing ever for this discussion, but what makes it useful is my job is really to figure out how to apply our system to our customers' needs. So just to give an idea of why we even exist, my co-founder, Mike Kowalenko, he was president of Biogen, went on to be the head of immunology and biotech at Wyeth and Pfizer. And if he was still at Pfizer, he'd be in charge of the vaccine, for example. So pretty high flyer type in pharma. But he was frustrated his entire career that there was no system that could pull together the data from all the different systems across his organization where he could get a full view of what was going on. And that's our goal, is to create that system. So Duarte, if you could skip on to the next slide. So the sentiment against artificial intelligence is one that I share. And I want to dig into why that is. So AI, and this is unfair to a lot of people that do study AI, but I'll continue. Hopefully this makes sense. So with AI, there's sophisticated algorithms that basically classify and predict based off of large amounts of data. The problem is how it's applied. So a good example is you get on YouTube, you watch one video about some guy that built a shed in back of his house, and now all you see is videos about building sheds from then on. So YouTube has this classification and recommendation algorithm that classifies videos in many different ways, and then it classifies you as to what you view. And all of these systems try to find the next best answer to the question. And that's great, I guess, until it's not. But the problem is there's no confidence in what that answer means. And that's the realm that we live in and Novi Systems is we're more on the intelligence augmentation side, which means people remain in control. People deal with ambiguity and machines do the tedium, but people control the machines. And also as you leverage the machines to calculate an answer, that answer comes with it, not just it's better than another answer, but how is that answer relative to the whole space that you're dealing with. So trying to think of an example. So just imagine if you're trying to predict an outcome and the machine answers that this outcome will be bad. Well, how bad? What is the confidence in that badness? Is it just a tick over zero in toward bad, or is it clearly on the end of the spectrum of bad? And these are the types of issues that we deal with often. So hopefully that makes sense. This slide is a bit of a dumpster fire. I didn't know a better way to get into it. So the next slide, Duarte, gets into our process. So we're all about decision making. So we want to start with the end in mind. What is the question that you want to answer? And then ask the question of what data supports the answer to that question, discover insights, and then that generally leads to other questions, and then you go in this virtuous cycle toward good things. And then as you discover insights, you can make the choice to create a data model that would classify or predict new data based off that model. And yeah, Duarte, skip on to the next. So to support this process, we developed a system that has basically 4 big components. Data unification, which is the ability to pull in data from multiple systems and then relate that data together so that it acts as one data set. And then we have the ability to see that data and then dynamically filter the data. And then if you choose to create a model, there are mechanisms to do that. And then all along the process, we have the ability to calculate analytics, both on numbers and text, because a lot of data is language and text-based. And one of the unique attributes of our system is the ability to take data that has lots of text and then relate those two data sets together from the terms that are common in each of those data sets. And I can show you examples in a minute. And in fact, Duarte, if you want to give me the con here, I'll see if I can share. Share my screen. So one of our customer sets is pharmaceutical manufacturing. So here's an example of 5 factories, and each factory produces a number of biologics and drugs and chemical drugs. And each one of them, as they produce these drugs, the notion of a manufacturing deviation occurs. People make mistakes, machines break, and by law, these deviations have to be tracked. And so these deviations are human-generated text blobs that describe what happened in that deviation. So this is a dashboard that shows our ability to see the data. So each widget on the dashboard reflects a different facet of the data. So this pie chart, for instance, shows how many biologics versus drugs, or in terms of deviation. So if I just want to see the biologics, I can click that. Then all the other widgets adjust to only show biologics. So I can see that Site 4 produces a lot of biologics. They produce 3 products. Product 10 has a bunch of lots, several production lines, and a fill line. So that gives you an idea of the filtering. So I'll remove the filters, and now I want to discover problems, and that's where the terms come in. So I created a dictionary of bad terms. So in a deviation, you don't want to see a term like vermin, like rats are bad when you're making a drug experiment. So so one that shows up often in this data set is cleaning. So if I click that, I can see that a lot of deviations show up in this fill line, this production line, this product. If I click that product, I can see this lot of that product is having a problem. So immediately I know where to go and investigate to figure out what's going on. So this gives an idea of how we can use numbers and text together, which unfortunately is not all that useful for this discussion. I just wanted to show kind of how the system does its thing. So what I'll do now is move on to more of a healthcare. More of a healthcare oriented application, and we've dedicated our company to helping kids with rare diseases. So rare diseases often happen in children because they're genetic in nature. So the disease presents itself very early, and there are 7,000, almost 8,000 of these rare diseases. And the problem is these diseases only affect maybe a few hundred people worldwide. So the knowledge about them that their physician would have is really low. So we want to create systems to make it easier for physicians to deal with their patients with rare diseases. One of the problems is reimbursement. So if I look at here, I'll search for a disease called CLN5, and this plot shows the relationship between the disease and its symptoms. And then if I go and select ICD-10 as the coding attribute, it goes away. And that means that there's no ICD-10 code, or there's no reimbursement code for this disease. So how does a physician then get reimbursed through a payer, through an insurance company, for the services they provide for the patient? So the way to do this is to figure out what symptoms are common to another disease, and then go to the payer and say, listen, there's no code for this, but pretty much the same as this other thing that you do pay for, and that generally is justification for reimbursement. And I can go through and show how we can put in symptoms and then find other common diseases.
John, can you quickly tell us what kind of data your machine is chewing up on to get these?
So for this case, we're pulling from a lot of different data. ORFA is a European organization that tracks symptoms and rare diseases. OMEM is a genetic database that keeps up with similar things, but it's more about the genetic deviations and the details with that. ICD-10, which is an international coding for diseases, that's something that we pull from. So all these different data sets are all interacting and working as one. So the thing I wanted to get to next, which is much more applicable for this discussion, is some data that I found. So I found some Airbnb data for Asheville. So this is 3 data sets. There's a data set for listings, which has, this data set is huge. It's got 74 columns that describes hosts, pricing, average review scores for many different things, the type of listing, and so on. The available unit days, that's another data set. And then the reviews for the listing is another data set. So what we have here is some natural language processing of the host, what the host used to describe themselves in the listing, and then the text that's in the review itself. So Duarte and I got together for a few minutes and came up with a dictionary of negative terms and a dictionary of positive terms. And so crowded showed up. So I'll click crowded. That'll then filter everything down just to those reviews that dealt with crowded. We can see that there's 151 reviews, which is related to 137 listings. And then if we care about the price, so I'll just pick some stuff in the middle here, then that filters it down to 56. Anyway, and so on. So whatever, the real question here is, what is the question to answer? And also, I found, just as a counter, I found some data on Austin. I created a similar dashboard that goes through Austin. And then I ran out of time, but what I'd like to do now is then relate these 2 dashboards together through some manner. Maybe it's the terms used to describe the neighborhoods or the listings or whatnot. So I think that's enough to give you a flavor of what we have going on. And for the sake of time, let's go ahead and open it up for discussion. Oh, one other thing before I do that. So Whitney mentioned policy, and one thing that we've dealt with in the past with some of our work is the notion of Pestle Analysis. So political, economic, social, technical, legal, environmental. And the idea is that's sort of a framework to view the entire sphere of information that's useful for whatever question you're trying to answer. And policy and this sort of thing is basically textual in nature. So that's something that we can unify with other more analytical and numerical data to maybe deal with some tourism issues.
Great.
So I'm really done now. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, John. So with all our presentations, this has taken us to like almost the time limit of our soft ending, but we'll be, going on for another 15 or 20 minutes where I'd like to have a structured discussion. So what my summary of what we've been doing is to kind of initially talk about that destinations kind of are as like a runaway freight train with a policy model that puts into destination organizations in charge of developing more tourism, and the more tourism they develop, the more occupancy tax they earn. And so it's like this stubborn and difficult to slow down path towards self-destruction. And so then we've started talking about, okay, so that's because the metrics that have been able to be tracked for success are number of visitors and amount of money and a number of jobs, not even the type of jobs or where the money stays, just those initial, very structured, simple metrics. Now, can we start first, then we start thinking about new metrics that are much messier that maybe we should pay attention to. We have been paying attention to, but we haven't had the tools to process those metrics. and create some understandable visualizations that the politicians and the community leaders can come to grasps with to then sway their decision on where to head next, right? Now, John shared with us how his machine, if allow me this oversimplification, is in the healthcare side, is looking at the doctor's notes about patients. And in the past, he's mentioned even research journals in medical journals, how, you know, the medicines and the symptoms of diseases are reported. And so his system is overlaying and cross-referencing complex unstructured text data, and also some tabular data from the pharmaceutical companies and the factories and stuff like that. And then, you know, he gave us just a little quick example of data that are out there from Airbnb, and applied it to Asheville and Austin, and looked at how, like, the owners like Isaiah and many of us, possibly, I certainly am also an Airbnb host back in my hometown in Portugal. How do we describe our community and our unit and ourselves? So he was able to, you know, we together were able to think of like words that we thought were important, to coach the machine a little bit to look for those words, and then it's able to, you know, to simplify, reduce the complexity to give us some visuals about that. So next, I think the most useful thing, because we're really just in the baby initial steps of trying to come to an understanding of how can we prepare ourselves to use this powerful tool. I'd like to turn to each of the panelists, and I have also notes from the chat on what should be next on us, communities, industry, and academics, to try to make steps so we can, you know, explore using this tool. I'd like to start with you, Bruno. You and I have some side conversations about kind of what you're a little worried about or uncertain about, you know, in the use of AI. Would you like to throw the first comment, and then other panelists, I would love if you would react to that, and we would build from there. Bruno? Bruno may be out, so can we, you know, Christine, Whitney, you're next. Would you like to suggest a topic that, you know, emerged to you as you prepared for the panel, and, you know, during the panel? Christine.
Absolutely, I can start us off as Bruno is making his way back on the screen. I would like to offer up the work of Yuval Noah Harari on AI. Yuval is the individual that wrote the book Sapiens and Homo Deus, and he's done a lot in terms of work on the notion of the benefits of AI, but also the ways in which we ought to be cautious, particularly those of us within the academic context. And so he says that we're in an era in which information is more accessible than it was ever before. You know, we're no longer back in the day where, you know, the student had to wait for a textbook, you know, and get the information. That was the only way in which they could access knowledge. Now knowledge is at the fingertips of every single person. So how does one teach the learner of today, recognizing that that is the case? He also talks about the fact that many of the roles that we're training the learner of today are jobs that are not going to be in existence, you know, 20 or 30 years down the road, because AI will have, you know, really rendered them obsolete, you know what I mean, and be able to do those jobs quite well. And so he says the skill that we need to teach is a skill of flexibility, because people are going to have to be able to adapt from one career to the next with a level of internal resolve, a level of emotional intelligence, a level of adaptability to new knowledge and new contexts than we ever have before. And so that's one key thing that I think is pertinent to the academic context. But the other thing to pay attention to in relation to what Yuval highlights in relation to AI is something that John mentioned, which is how the AI knowledge is applied and how it is utilized. And Yuval talks about something that he refers to as data dictatorship or data colonialism, where it says that there's knowledge, you know, data being collected from a variety of different locations around the world, but it ends up being housed by one or two companies who then choose how to apply that knowledge. And we've reached a point where he says that AI technology will actually be in a state of knowing us individuals, human beings, better than we know ourselves. So the question becomes, we are in a society, actually we are within a scientific community where even the self, the I, is rendered generally obsolete, right? And so here we are actually in a state where AI technology is going to know us better than we know ourselves. And so if it's following you, as John had mentioned, based on what you're searching, it's following you based on the information on your medical biometrics, it's following you in terms of your outdoor activities. It can predict in many cases what the next steps are. And so that information, I think, in the hands of the wrong people can be incredibly detrimental to self and to the collective. And so the question becomes, as scientists, as community citizens, how do we go back to engaging in the things that we know AI cannot do? How do we teach individuals to become emotionally resilient? How do we learn about self and ensure that we are aware of self, and that a machine cannot manipulate our sense of self? And how do we stay up with the technological innovation, but be also cognizant of the ethics around those elements? So that's what I wanted to offer up.
Thanks, Christine. Can I ask you to put in the chat, sharing with all, that book? I personally will try to pick that up and fetch it out because it's very relevant. And indeed, of the 50 or so people with us today, if you have any resources, a website or a reading that you recommend, please put it on the chat for the benefit of all. So Bruno, we had reached out to you earlier. If you could build on Christine's comment and kind of follow up. And I wanted to mention that Shaky also kind of made a comment related to what you've shared with me before the webinar. She mentioned that governments usually serve foreign investor interests instead of focusing on, serving the host community. And so could these be related to your, question or, uncertainty about how AI might sway policy?
Thank you, Duarte. Well, I think Christine used the term optimistic cynicism. I think I'll settle for optimistic skepticism in the way that I recognize that AI is here to stay. It can be a powerful tool, but it's not a panacea. It's just a resource available to us, just like any other resource. And I feel that many in our field have jumped into this bandwagon, and most or many don't know what they are signing up for. And I think that's problematic. I read a paper that has received many accolades, and what they did was to look at TripAdvisor reviews in one of Europe's most popular capitals. And they ran that data against hotel occupancy. And they realized, or they found, that the relationship is not linear, but follows an inverted U shape. So very few tourists is not good because there's this feeling of emptiness, and too many tourists, of course, because of the obvious reasons. I think this is just fascinating. And also they were able to establish that inflection point in the U corresponded to, I think, 40-something% occupancy rate. Well, from an intellectual point of view, I think this is fascinating. But, and there's always the but, so what do you do with that? Are you going to convince the formal industry that they should stop at 40% occupancy rate? I don't think so, right? And on top of that, when you get to the limitations of the paper, you read things like automatic textual analysis is not able to distinguish scathing reviews. And I'm thinking, if I want to bash a destination, I'm going to use a lot of sarcasm. And not only is that not going to count as a negative sentiment, that's going to inflate the positive sentiment. And I think this is problematic in and of itself. And I actually had the opportunity to confront the author of this paper, because it was presented at a famous conference. And what this author told me is that, well, we kind of outsourced this AI thing, so we don't really know what the ontologies were, or how they dealt with semantic and nuanced meanings. So I think there's a lot of limitations, and I think we as academicians need to be more critical about this.
Thank you. So John and Isaiah, if I could, I'd like to ask you to comment next, and then to kind of get us grounded back into kind of John would say AI is a tool. We need to kind of learn how to use it or see its limitations. So maybe we'd start with that. And then Isaiah, if you could come next and bring us back to the locals perspective, because the reason I'm saying that is Bruno just gave an example of an influential paper, or a paper that got attention, but it's looking at visitors' unstructured data. And this is about locals' unstructured data being brought onto the analysis. So let's try to do that. And then Whitney, if I can get you back on, and Kazem and Jafar, we would then have time for the two of you to also kind of share some thoughts. All right. So John, if you could react to this, because you yourself have pointed out what AI can be and what it should not be seen as. And you're muted.
Of course, I'm muted. Yeah, so Bruno brings up a good point. So there's an interesting trade-off with text analytics and language in general, that in the trade-off is between specificity and confidence. So the more specific you intend to classify the data, the less confident you can be in the result. So what do you do with that? Well, so we're actually pretty good at dealing with positive and negative sentiment, but degrees of positive and degrees of negative, and trying to make decisions based on that is probably not a good idea. Language from a computing standpoint is very inaccurate. Well, sorry, let me be more precise. The decisions we make about what language means is very imprecise. And so we're looking at, a 65 to 80% accuracy rate. So then when you start dialing up the precision, you're asking for problems. So that's one thing I would say. The other is the sarcasm thing is actually a well-known. There are well-known ways of dealing with that. And a couple of, just to throw them out there, there's a sarcasm dictionary, believe it or not, for English, that's really good at detecting sarcasm and then being able to determine if it's kind of opposite of what it's trying to say. The other is vectorization of the terms in the text. You can detect the use of sarcasm. But at the same time, how sarcastic, how good, how bad, that's a fool's errand.
All right. Thanks, John. And I'd like to get back to you, but Whitney, I know you have a hard time limit in 2 minutes. Would you share a couple of comments before you have to leave us?
Yeah, sure. And John, thanks. I really appreciate where you're going with that. Duarte, I love that you set up the academic panel with 3 academics who really love qualitative research to talk about this, because I think we all bring, these critical thoughts about it. And I guess I see AI as one more tool in the toolkit for us to do a better job of assessing these impacts and utilizing, some of the techniques that John showed us about indicators of, if it was the case of compensation for disease and things like that. If we can find those right indicators to trigger a more in-depth and rich exploration of these. You know, I could envision, like, if you're seeing a certain number of hits of certain words in the comments on online news stories, that would signal to a DMO, hey, there's something going on here that, you know, this isn't just people having too much time on their hands and commenting on these online news stories. This is a serious thing that we need to have a procedure, almost like a crisis management kind of procedure, that you would say, okay, we now implement this strategy of convening this group of residents and people who are not directly related or employed in the hotel and the tourism industry to talk about these issues, and having those lines of communication set up and ready to go. So when those sort of triggers do hit, you can actually get in there and get the deep understanding that you need, I think would be a sort of best of both worlds approach that we could harness the power of AI and then still get that richer understanding. So I'll leave it at that. And thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. This was a wonderful way to start my day. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Whitney. And actually, this comment leads, with a little soundbite I wanted to share, because, Bruno mentioned how research with AI often involves tourism professors or researchers and partners outsourcing the AI analysis, and that is definitely perhaps a worse practice kind of approach. What I hope that we can accomplish through this is that the tourism folks can come closer to understand how they can use AI, and then partners like John started to understand tourism, and then we create this convergence that can, be very impactful. So very good. Isaiah, would you be willing to bring us back to the perspective of local? What does this all make you think about?
One thing I'm thinking about is, thinking about Airbnb reviews, is because you're talking about local perceptions.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just thinking how, everything's reviewed today, like hotels, restaurants, and tourist sites, but very few of those do the sites then review the people who come. But Airbnb is one of these where I get reviewed, but I also review the people who stay. And so it's maybe one of the few platforms where you might have, I don't know if you did have access, John, in that research of not just what the guest review the place they visit, but what I write as a review for the guests who stay here. That could be useful information, although I know I would think it'd be flawed, because even though I have a high rating for my place, I know I'm not that good. And even though I give universally good ratings to the people who stay here just out of courtesy, I try to stay positive. So I know it'd be kind of somewhat falsely inflated, but
Mm-hmm.
at least it is a platform which the guests are getting reviewed as well as the venue.
But in your presentation, you brought us to several editorial newspaper articles and kind of the daily newspaper discussion. And you've mentioned that in your text, how the locals are complaining about things. And so you've provided us with some hints on what kind of unstructured data we can be looking for. Jafar and Kazem, I would love to hear from you. Can I, John, ask you I know you also need to leave soon. Do you have anything to share as we get ready for Kazem and Jafar to join us for some final comments?
Just in general, this is very interesting to me, and Duarte, hanging out with you for the last several years, I've definitely learned a lot. And it is a tool. Tools can be very dangerous if used improperly, but at the same time, if it's contained within the limits of what it can do, it can be very powerful.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm interested in finding those things that would be useful to help people.
I'll point two things, and then Kazem and Jafar, if you would join us. Tanisha just mentioned that AI can be complex, and so some people are wedged out of learning how to use it. And I wonder, though, there's chat bots and there's apps and things like that. I wonder if there's examples or ways in which we can bring AI powerfulness to make it just a little bit simpler. John, you mentioned that in the medical and pharma system, there's the writing of the symptoms and stuff, and you wondered if tourism needs to start creating proactive ways of collecting local sentiment, like local, electronic comment boxes, or destinations might have to create a locals app where locals can give suggestions or make complaints, and then there are these data that can be analyzed to measure their sentiment. And to finish my 2 cents, Christine, yesterday as we were talking, you mentioned that we need to get on top of this, right? Like we can't just dismiss this or that as like something that's wrong or too complicated or whatever. We need to kind of come to grasp with this new reality that it's here to stay. The commercial sector, the pro-tourism development sector is embracing it. So if we that are more measured about the potential of tourism don't jump on this space and try to understand how to use it, then we are fulfilling the prophecy, of that, we become irrelevant. So if I could, we can continue discussing, but if I could ask Kazem and Jafar to chime in with your perspectives on the discussion, and then we'll adjourn from the webinar in a few minutes after that.
Thank you very much, Duarte, and every one of you for your individual contributions and then collectively coming together. Very interesting points were raised, and really talking about them at the end when we are going to close the session in a few minutes may not serve that much of purpose. But going back to our SCoT series, what is unique about SCoT series is that we want to concentrate on communities, small communities. You see, I didn't say destination. Destination is a tourism vocabulary word. Community. And communities come in small and large communities. And usually we are dealing with the small communities. And the small communities, many of them are in sociology, anthropology. We categorize them into closed communities and open communities. And I think today we were talking mostly about open communities. For example, when when Isaiah was talking about Asheville, it was very clear that it is an open community, not a closed community. In Wisconsin, we have some communities of 300 years history, which are closed communities. So I want to make that distinction, which is very important. Bruno was mentioning about marginalized minorities. Well, usually marginalized communities are a segment of another community or in the same community who are becoming the attraction for tourism against their wishes. So we have to think about those situations as well. When Whitney talked about attitude, what kind of residence, that also suggests that there are different kinds of residence there, and therefore it has been open society, open community. And Christine, repackaging the past for the tourist, I suppose. Therefore, that's again may not be the case of closed society. And finally, coming to John, thank you very much to every one of you for your presentation. AI. Well, in this webinar series, not only we emphasize the concept of community, but also the concept of host and guest and hospitality. Hospitality comes from the heart of the people, especially local people, etc. So I have lots of questions to ask, but we don't have time, Duarte. So I go to the last one, John, and I ask you, or first I say that hospitality is in the core of tourism. The spirit of tourism is hospitality. What makes North Carolina is the hospitality. And the culture behind it, etc., etc. How could AI help us to deliver hospitality? John.
Yeah, I'm thinking, that's a really good question. First, I guess maybe first understanding how hospitality is expressed, how hospitality is perceived, through language, and these limited channels that are used to express it in systems like Airbnb. So there's the language that the host used to describe their property. There's also a section that describes the neighborhood, which is I found really interesting. That may be a good place to start. And then as we dig into that, maybe we'll find that data is missing, and then we need to find ways to develop these data that would help us understand deeper. So that's all I can offer, is just kind of a way to start exploring.
Mhm. If I can,
I didn't suggest that this is an easy question. It's an extremely difficult question. But if we are talking about tourism and hospitality, we have to see how AI would help in the area of hospitality and the delivery of it. I don't want to say more. I just wanted to plant the seeds which belong to the SCoT series, the concerns we have. And of course, we are dealing most of the times, without mentioning, we are dealing with closed communities who are reluctant to open their doors to tourism. And we enter it, and then we want to survey them and to fix their attitude towards tourism, etc., etc. So this, I wanted to be aired out. Thank you.
Thanks, Jafar. And if I might, this is an interesting topic. In a way, it kind of brings to fore a bit of a reinforcing cycle. Maybe 6 years ago, Airbnb, maybe 5, partnered with, I think it was like the Sheraton Hotel or one of those big luxury hotel chains, to create a training for Airbnb hosts on how to provide high quality hospitality. And that was very myopic, very naive of them. It was a huge pushback from Airbnb hosts that said, we're not providing hotel style hospitality. We want to provide a genuine local hospitality. But interestingly, when John and I were looking at the Airbnb data from Asheville, we looked at how the Airbnb hosts were describing themselves and their location and their neighborhood. And there were just a lot of the same stuff, like we're very close to the Biltmore, we're very close to the national parks, and not as much as I think they might want to, that this is a living neighborhood. And there's a special corner store where you can meet the locals, So to some degree, the Airbnb hosts and the locals become victims of kind of a self, reinforcing cycle where they think that the tourists want high quality, and so they describe themselves as high quality. Like, we have a chocolate on your pillow. If you do that, instead of saying there's a local tavern where you can get wine from the farmers, then the locals themselves are slowing down the creation of circular economies and of distinction from other destinations. So it is complicated. Now, who's going to break that cycle? Should it be people like us that are engaging with communities? We can advise them and create training modules that maybe Airbnb would be willing to share. So that kind of, it needs to affect how we, every member of the tourism and destination system intervenes. Kazem, would you have something to contribute? And then we can turn it back to the panelists a little bit, and then we should adjourn in a little while. Go ahead, Kazem.
Thank you, Duarte. It was very interesting presentations. I am still learning. Maybe back to Jafar's question, that was very thoughtful. I think, Jafar, I give you an example from Japan that AI predicted that in February and March, we have another wave of the pandemic. And it was predicted maybe a few months ago. So the hotel industry and accommodation and hospitality people, they have been kind of prepared for that. And it just happened. I don't know how it happened, but it happened. So I think AI or intelligent, artificial intelligence has its own platform and infrastructure. So it's nothing that happens at once, the big data and the big data series. So there should be a system, and the system should be part of the community itself. And community should collaborate to keep update the system, to have this data to be able to use for the community itself. So we need to create the capacity for the community that they can utilize AI for the sake of the community itself. So it's a kind of a cycle of development and capacity building with the community. And once this is created, the database, and because it's artificial, if it is traditional, maybe many of them, we cannot find the correlations of the customer behavior and the cycles of this market changes over the time, or change of the people's taste and so on. But if we can keep this data and find ways of analyzing the data and give feedback to the community and to the industry, I think AI is something that is unavoidable and necessary from now on. So we cannot think of competitive or smart destinations without AI. And I'm sure that is a very wide topic that we cannot conclude it in a small session like this. And I would like to thank all presenters again, and wish you all the best. And thank you for contribution to SCoT webinars. Thank you, Duarte, for moderating this good webinar too.
Thank you, Kasem. So within an hour and 45 minutes of having started, it's time to come to an end. We can linger a little bit, those that are willing and have time to chat a little bit. But before that, and before we close the live session, I wanted to point out that we have these type of webinar every month. And the next one will be from a network of colleagues focusing on villages in Indonesia. And then in April, I'll have the pleasure to be the host again of a webinar. And this one will focus on how Black landowners in North Carolina are trying to, and sometimes succeeding to, use tourism to hold on to their lands and pass it on to their progeny, to the next generation. And with that, I will